The Mendocino Fire Safe Council, in cooperation with the University of California Cooperative Extension, present How Homes and Buildings Are Threatened by Wildfire with Steve Quarles and Yana Yalakovic.
I think it's important just to sort of set the stage for building vulnerabilities to wildland fire to understand the basic threats to homes and buildings to wildland fire. And as you can see here, there are three basic exposures that we need to be worried about. One is the wind-blown ember. The other is if flames can directly contact the building, your home. And the third is whether your home can be impacted by extended radiant heat exposures. Radiant heat is the heat that you might feel standing in front of a campfire, but the radiant heat level is larger, higher, and the duration will be longer typically.
And Steve, I think this is the really interesting point, because I think most people are thinking about flames touching their homes, that's what's driving the home loss issue in the Western United States. But it's a little more complicated than that. And if we just singly prepare for flames, we're missing sort of these two other really key exposure issues that I think few of us are very well prepared for.
As important as wind-blown embers are, and they are the most important thing when it comes to home and building ignitions, at the end of the day, you end up with flame contact or extended radiant heat exposures that that the embers cause damage. And we have this example to point to what Yana was talking about in terms of it's not the flames from the wildfire, it's the ember. And we see this is a picture from the 2007 Angora fire in South Lake Tahoe. A completely destroyed home in this case, surrounded by green vegetation. So the wildland fire clearly didn't burn to the building, but embers from another source landed on, near, or in this home and then it ignited and burned to the ground. And unlike most interior home fires where a fire truck can show up because there's just one home to show up to and help extinguish the fire, this fire, was small at the beginning, but burned to the ground because the fire department just cannot go to every house during a wildland fire when a lot of homes are burning.
Yeah, and sort of defies what we think about when you see all that vegetation still green and doing okay, but what happened, Yep. Did aliens come from space and and take that house out? No, probably not, but yeah. There are other mechanisms that these homes burn from.
So I as we're talking about the importance of embers, I think it's important for you, the listener here, to understand why they're so important. And Yana and I talk about this why part in terms of direct ember ignition and indirect ember ignition. The upper left-hand picture in this slide is from the research facility in Richburg, South Carolina. That's this facility is operated and run by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. It's a very nice wind tunnel kind of facility, and at the IBHS facility, we can create these ember exposures that you see from these ember generators that can throw embers at a full-size building. And so a lot of what we know today about vulnerabilities of homes and buildings to embers, comes from research that was conducted there. So direct ember ignition, the bottom fence picture, embers landed on the fence on that horizontal plank to horizontal board to vertical plank to post intersection in there, and ignited those combustible materials directly without any help from vegetation and other things. So that's an example of direct ember ignition. It can happen with a wood shake roof. It can happen with a wooden deck. It's just with the embers alone igniting something. And then the right-hand picture includes examples of indirect ember ignition. And in these cases, we have embers igniting bark mulch next to the house. We have embers igniting a debris and gutter. And then that results in either a radiant heat exposure, depending on where the thing that gets ignited is, or in both of these cases, a direct flame contact exposure. So to the siding from the ground, and then to the edge of the roof from the gutters. But you'll notice that the left-hand part of the gutter, that's a plastic or vinyl gutter. So those typically detach and fall to the ground when debris in them ignites. And so it's an edge of the roof flame contact exposure until that gutter detaches and falls to the ground. And then it's a flaming thing on the ground issue. The metal gutter on the right-hand side of the picture, it stays put. And so it's always an edge of roof flame contact exposure. But so these are indirect ignition scenarios that have resulted in flame contact to the building.
It's kind of like it's what you're trying to illustrate here is sort of the phased approach, like what falls first and how does that create an additional exposure, an additional challenge? Like, you know, it's sort of like the domino effect where you see something ignite, it's rather small, but then that kind of sort of cascades into the next sequence of issues. And so the challenge, I think, for the homeowner is to be able to see those and figure out how to create mitigations or how to decouple to prevent that sequencing where possible. And I think the other piece is this, that we can show vulnerability in the fence and we can show vulnerability in the gutter. And we're not saying that you need to not have gutters or not have fences, because we know fences make great neighbors, but there's ways to design that fence that can reduce some of the exposure to the home, and there's ways to manage the gutters so that it prevents litter accumulation in them, because we need gutters. Otherwise, we have issues associated with our siding and all the water that comes down and, you know, causes additional complications and rot failures in the lower portions of the siding. So important features, we just need to make some modifications.
So if you take this picture here that is taken in Mendocino County by one of your Fire Safe Council colleagues, you can imagine that should a fire start somewhere just to the right of the right-hand border of the picture, that fire could burn directly to the house in this case. They can get there. You'll notice that there's a lumber yard pile of lumber here in the left-hand part of the picture. So the fire can move directly to the home. So the point of vegetation management on the property, and that vegetation management, you know, as I try to broaden it to include vegetation and other combustibles, such as this lumber pile that we see here. You need to take steps so that the fire can burn. We'll talk about some of those steps here in a second. But then you also, even if all that vegetation were missing, you saw absolutely no vegetation at all, and this wood pile, lumber pile that you see here was gone. Homeowners typically don't own enough property to avoid an ember exposure to the home itself. So even if you've done everything great in a way of preparing your property in terms of defensible space, you still need to make your home able to resist an ember exposure, because embers have been shown to fly upwards of a mile, and clearly a quarter mile to a half a mile is easy enough for embers to fly and still have energy enough to ignite combustible materials on, in, or near your home.
And we're trying to demystify the process, because I think for a lot of folks, it just feels overwhelming. Like, oh, there's just so much vegetation. It grows every year. How do I manage it? I'm barely keeping up with, you know, the chores, the homework, the grocery shopping, the meal planning, all that stuff. But a few small strategic choices can make a world of difference. And this is sort of our pathway forward to living in California, because California is going to burn. It's going to it's designed, it's adapted the vegetation for burning, and so we've got our homes in the middle of it. So how do we become, you know, smarter and more resilient in this time period, so that we are less impacted by wildfire and can, you know, have a thriving, prosperous life?
And so, in that light, this slide is just here to the left-hand part really is just a short checklist that reminds you that there are property things that need to be done, and there are home or house things that need to be done. When we talk about property things. It's, generically called creating defensible space, but that is the vegetation management part and the other combustibles part on the property. And then there are things to do to your home. And the home, we typically break the home down into its parts. So roof, wall, then attachments, which would be a fence or a deck. And then we talk about those individually, but it's really important that you understand that these things are connected on your house, and they are connected. And so things that might be vulnerable on your wall can reach your roof, can reach events. So the home is a system. We talk about it in terms of components, but really everything needs to act together. So here's just a picture. We really talk about defensible space in terms of zones. We have a zone really close to your home. We have a zone that goes from close to your home to a little bit further out, and then further out than that. If your property is only, has a external limit of 25 feet, then these always just go from some foot, like 5 feet, to your property line, or from 30 feet to your property line. But when your neighbor's 20 or 30 feet away, that just means that you and your neighbor have to have a conversation, because you don't want your home to be threatening your neighbor's home, and you don't want your neighbor's home to be threatening you during a wildland fire. But this whole thing about defensible space, as you can see here, the careful selection, careful location, and maintenance of vegetation and other combustibles. Other combustibles can be a wood pile, a lumber pile, your RV, your boat, any number of things that are combustible that many people have. You need to be aware that these other things can also be a threat to your home should they ignite. And so you want to keep these things from igniting, or if they ignite, you don't want them to threaten your home or your neighbor's home for that matter. So we focus a lot on this near your home area. These are, and that near your home area includes the under the footprint of attached decks. We have a couple of pictures of that here. So reducing the combustible materials, whether it be vegetation or other things like a wood pile really close to your home, we really want to avoid those things. So these are two good examples of what we call the near home zone or the non-combustible zone, the 0 to 5 foot zone. Entities, organizations have given different names to this next to your home area. Don't get hung up on the name itself. You'll see it called a number of things these days, because there isn't really a globally decided on name for this area next to your home. And the reason why decks are so important and included here is because if they ignite, it's just a pathway directly to your home. And often, most people that have a deck have a way to get onto that deck from the house. And these are typically weak points. So a door, sliding glass door, and the siding right next to the deck. So you just want to make sure that your deck doesn't result in the destruction of your home. And so storing stuff under your deck, like you see in the lower right-hand picture, it's just really difficult for any deck to survive a burning fire that would occur should that lumberyard there ignite and burn. So part and parcel with this horizontal non-combustible zone that we just talked about, you need to also have this vertical non-combustible zone, because embers will accumulate at the base of the wall at the ground. And so if your combustible siding goes all the way to the ground, then regardless of whether you have a non-combustible zone horizontally or not, you'll still have the potential to ignite siding that goes really close to the ground. The left-hand picture from the IBHS Research Center just demonstrating that siding to the ground easily ignited, but if you have non-combustible areas between the ground and the start of the siding, those embers cannot ignite the combustible siding. So you need to make sure you have this non-combustible vertical zone in addition to, or in conjunction with, this horizontal zone that we've been talking about just in the last couple of minutes. So here's an example, again, from your area, Mendocino County, that shows good example of this horizontal zone where there's nothing to ignite. This is a non-combustible siding product, it's fiber cement siding product. So that's good in and of itself, but I think you also want to have, this is a really good example using this block as an example of a concrete-like foundation against a stone patio, or two non-combustible surfaces. This is a good example of what we're looking for here. And this is an example of something that leaves something to be desired, just because the siding goes all the way to the ground. There's some fine fuels right at the base of the wall that will be easily ignited by embers.
Including that flexible corrugated hose.
Yes, exactly. That just more fuel for the fire, so to speak. And this is a pier and post foundation, so there isn't a crawl space. It's just the house is held up by piers all around the perimeter and through the in the underhouse portion. There's no screening. There's no other enclosure of this underhouse area. You need to be concerned about here because fire can burn directly there, and you might have the potential to store stuff in this area. So I would say that in these kind of situations, you could screen that with eighth of an inch mesh screen around that will allow air circulation to occur and minimize the accumulation of the combustible fuels, fine fuels that might be blown under there. You could also enclose it with a non-combustible wrap.
I think one of the challenges we have, this looks like it's a tiny house, and so it's maybe designed to be portable to some extent, is that it allows sunlight to get underneath. And so there's always going to be this kind of battle against the grasses and other, small plants that are trying to get established under there. So if you have one of these situations, you just need to be a little bit up on your vegetation management and make sure you're cleaning out underneath that space. And then if you can't screen it, because it makes it difficult for the vegetation management, make sure that there isn't like a wood planter box on the other side where that, if you do get embers underneath, that they move underneath the building and then, run into something where they can create another ignition.
I think here the point is just to have what you can see with little green vegetation is just have islands of vegetation. You don't want any one of those islands that might ignite to have a continuous path to your home or to another island. So you want to make sure that should an island of vegetation ignite, it stays right there. It doesn't grow beyond that individual island to other islands. And if it does via ember transfer, that ultimately a burning island of vegetation cannot threaten your home. And you don't want to have other combustibles that you don't see there. You don't see a wood pile next to the house. You don't see a tool shed near the house. Those kind of things.
Yeah, I think really it's just about, breaking up the fuel profile so that if you have fire approaching your house, that it lays down and, the flame lengths then reduce in height. It may creep along, but if you've broken your vegetation into islands, then it doesn't have the continuity to kind of bring that fire to the house. And so, thinking in those ways where you've got, this term discontinuity, where things are separated so they can't just wick directly to the house. That's the idea. Doesn't mean no vegetation, doesn't mean that you can't have privacy. It's really just about being strategic about how you do that and then creating ways to kind of block that movement of fire to the house.
So we're going to talk a minute about neighborhoods. Inevitably, I think the fires that most of us remember are the ones where a lot of homes are lost. And when a lot of homes are lost, inevitably it becomes a lot of home-to-home fire spread, as we saw in Coffey Park during the Tubbs fire. Some of the things we've been talking about in terms of details are in terms of ember exposure resistance. Those are things where how the siding is put together, how far from the ground you place it, things like that. They're really important, more important than, say, the material itself. But when you have to worry about your neighbor's house burning, then having non-combustible siding, for example, is a better option, just because of the potential for an extended radiant heat exposure or even flames touching your house. When we're talking about neighborhoods, I think it very quickly moves to a community effort, so that no individual home is really threatening another home. Because when that happens, then it becomes sort of a domino effect of home igniting home, as we saw here. So embers are important, but also being able to resist flames and radiant heat is also clearly important.
And really the idea here is that we're all in it together, right? And your survival is just as much dependent on what you've done as what your neighbors have done. And so, how do we protect our most vulnerable? How do we help those that are less able, either with, their weekend efforts, or financially less able, or physically have challenges? So what we're talking about is, and if you live in a dense neighborhood, which is wonderful for many reasons, we all have to work on this together. And that's what resilience is going to mean, is the ability for a community to pivot and work on an issue and then sort of solve it collectively.
This is an Eastern Tennessee fire, but it applies. We see what radiant heat can do. So here on the left-hand picture, we have a burning cabin that threatened a neighboring home that was 30 feet or so away, let's say. And we can see small flames in this under-eave area that was a direct result of the radiant heat exposure from the house on the right. And the right-hand picture, this fully engulfed home 10, 15 minutes later. So there's a really rapid fire growth. This is just a clear example of what a neighbor can do to another neighbor, and the importance of being able to resist radiant heat exposures in these situations. But as Jan has said, it really has to be a community-wide effort so that this first home, in this case, doesn't ignite in the first place. So there is no radiant heat threat to the second home or neighboring home.
So in this series, we'll talk about dense neighborhoods. We'll talk about, community trailer parks, and we'll talk about homes that are, in more of the wildland, and maybe on with, a bigger parcel, and sort of scale in between, and help sort of pinpoint the particular issues with each of those situations and what you can do. Hopefully we've, piqued your curiosity and helped open the door to a few issues to try and think about. We know not everyone's going to take it all on in 1 year, so it's about creating a plan of and a strategy, and figuring out what you can implement in the near term and what you need to work on as a community to take on in the longer term.